Okay, so welcome everybody to this morning's session on decoding hieroglyphs. This is a revised and expanded, improved, I hope, version of the talk I first gave in Lytham earlier this year, although it was intended as a kind of lecture celebrating the 200th anniversary of the decipherment of hieroglyphs by Jean Francois Champollion. So what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about the Egyptian language in script, a little bit about how it evolved, how it came to disappear, how our knowledge of how to read it came to disappear, and how we came to recover that knowledge thanks to the efforts, most famously of Jean Francois Champollion, but also of others. And at the very end, for any of you who are not very experienced with reading the language, and I know that some of you probably are experienced with reading the language and know it well, and reading the hieroglyphic script. For any of you who are not so familiar, we'll just have a little go at decoding a very simple short inscription, a royal name with an epithet. In fact, just to kind of run through the process, which I hope might provide a sort of a window onto how the language works, and help sort of cement how you understand how Champollion got to the point he did of being able to read text for the first time in modern times. So my slide here shows a rather nice inscription, or part of it, from the Temple of Ramesses II at Abydos. Some of you will have visited probably. It requires you to walk either across the low desert or through the village of Araba el Madfuna from the Temple of Seti I, which is the larger and more famous temple at Abydos. The Ramesses temple is very famous in particular for the color that's preserved on the reliefs on the inside of the temple. It's a real wow from that point of view. And this is a part of a decorated surface that involves simply rows of hieroglyphs, all of which spell out variations of the name and titles of Ramesses II. So what we're looking at here says, the great god, the lord of the two lands, Uza Ma'at Ra, beloved of Horus, the son of Ra, the lord of the risings, Ramesses, beloved of Ammon, beloved of Osiris, and there are further rows with similar variations of his name both above and below this. But it caught the sun nicely, and I thought this would do as a kind of opening slide. So here we go. To begin with, a bit of etymology. The word hieroglyphs comes from the Greek hieroglyphikos, which itself is a compound of two Greek words, hieros, meaning sacred or holy, and glyphair, meaning carved work. So hieroglyphs are sacred carvings, if you like. And the word hieroglyphikos was already in use at the time that writers like Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus were providing us with descriptions, or providing principally their Greek and Roman world audiences with descriptions of ancient Egypt and various aspects of its culture. So they were referring to the inscriptions which at that time were still being carved anew onto temple walls and other monuments as hieroglyphikos. So it's entirely appropriate for us to use this word to describe the script, that is one of the most famous aspects of ancient Egyptian culture. And it is indeed one of the defining features of the culture of ancient Egypt, civilization of ancient Egypt. This, of course, is a civilization which occupies this part of Northeast Africa, the Nile Valley and the Delta, which came into being in approximately 3000 BCE, at a moment in time, it seems, when the country was unified under a single ruler, and this brings about the establishment of the culture throughout this part of the world. the kind of markers of that culture were the language, the script, also a certain style in art, iconography, set of religious beliefs. And there were regional variations, of course, that persisted over time. But it seems that at this moment of unification, that the essence of that culture spreads throughout this territory, and Egypt, a recognizable ancient Egypt, establishes itself. And one of the most sort of striking features of Egyptian culture, I will have said this before in my talks, is just how long this culture with all of these identifying markers lasted for, from this point around 3000 BC until well into the current era, a few centuries into the current era. And hieroglyphs were still in use, certainly down into Roman times. As we'll see, the very last hieroglyphic inscription, or the last we have any evidence for anyway, dates to the late 4th century of the current era. So given that, in fact, we now know that hieroglyphs were in use a little before the beginning of the first dynasty, at least as far back as what we call Dynasty Zero, a kind of precursor line of rulers prior to the first dynasty, and down into Roman times, they were in use for well over 3 millennia. And in that way, their appearance and their disappearance is a part of the way in which we think of Egyptian culture having started and ended, if you like. It's not the only feature, but it's one of those key identifying markers. And just to demonstrate that, this is one of the most celebrated of the earliest monuments to have survived from the early dynastic. This is the famous Narmer palette discovered at Hierapolis in the late 19th century by British excavators, now in the Egyptian Museum. Palettes like this would originally have been functional objects used for mixing pigments or something like that. But by this point, the early first dynasty, they had come to be created for ceremonial purposes. Large decorated slate palettes like this one had ceremonial function only. And the decoration on this one is highly significant, about as significant a decorated objects as we have from ancient Egypt in some ways. As you can see, it features on the left here, on one side of the palette, a man wearing what is clearly the white crown of Upper Egypt that would appear in Egyptian iconography for centuries and centuries after this point, raising a mace in one hand, which he is about to use to strike this foreign-looking individual, who the main character is grasping by the hair. This so-called smiting scene, of course, is a motif that we would see again recurring over the centuries. It's a very Egyptian motif. The white crown, ditto the red crown, which we see on the other side of the palette in this smaller figure of the same person. Here also is a feature that recurs over and over and over again. And then we have a falcon here. We have bulls. The king is wearing some kind of animal tail here. We have conquered enemies being trampled beneath the feet of the king, sort of tumbling here and there. Beheaded captives on the other side here. Altogether, we have a whole series of motifs. The very style that the figures are carved in as well is recognizably the style of Egyptian art that would continue for centuries and centuries. Lots and lots of motifs here, which would continue to be distinctive to Egyptian art and iconography, are in place at this very early date. And along with all of those things, and there are hieroglyphs present as well in this enclosure at the top, in the middle, in between the bulls' heads. And here you see it a little bit better. The enclosure appears to represent it's takes the form of this kind of palace facade feature, if you like. These little linear kind of niches here in relief on the surface of the palette echo the rectangular niches in the facade of fortifications from this early period of Egyptian history, probably genuine fortification walls from towns or garrisons or whatever, but also later from ceremonial walls surrounding enclosures like the Shunet Nesebi, but Baidos from a little while later, and from mastaba tombs as well. So this is a very distinctive feature of monumental mud brick walls in ancient Egypt at this time. So this is enclosing two hieroglyphic signs here: a catfish, which we think has the phonetic value, the sound value na, and then this is a chisel here, which has the value mer. So together we read na mer, and we believe that their position inside this enclosure denotes the fact that these are the name of an important individual, specifically the main character in the scene on the left-hand side here, who is clearly a ruler, a king. So this is King Narmer, and we believe that the events that are depicted on the palette are perhaps the very moment at which Narmer conquers his enemies, and in so doing unifies Egypt under his rule. So although it's difficult to be absolutely certain about this, the generally accepted view is that Narmer is the one, and this is the moment at which Egypt as a unified nation in this part of Northeast Africa comes into being, and his name is written in hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are present at that moment, and they would of course continue to be very important, as we've seen, for centuries after this point. That word hieroglyphs, sacred carvings, is appropriate in some ways, in many ways. Of course, it's hieroglyphs that were used to write inscriptions on temple walls, tomb walls, statuary, various monuments of various kinds. This, incidentally, is a scene from the opposite end of Egyptian history. This is from the birth house of Augustus Caesar, first Roman emperor, at Dendera, but in fact the decoration dates from even later, from the time of Trajan and Hadrian. And while in the beginning, with the earliest instances we have of hieroglyphic writing, you generally only find a scattering of signs, and usually only very small numbers sort of grouped together as if they are simply individual words rather than long sentences or longer texts. Of course, by this point, extremely long texts could be written in long sequences of dozens, hundreds of hieroglyphic signs expressing all kinds of complex ideas. Although, of course, they were still being used to write simple label texts, as in a scene like this one as well. They could also be used, of course, for funerary literature, and not only carved into stone and other hard substances, but written in ink on papyrus as well. So this is a good example of such a thing. This is the Book of the Dead of Nojmet, who was the wife of Herihor. This is now preserved in the British Museum. It's one of the finest examples in the collection of a Book of the Dead papyrus. This is from the 21st dynasty, or late 20th, early 21st dynasty. And as you can see here, the hieroglyphs are written as if a little bit more quickly, and of course they're written by hand by an experienced scribe here, rather than hammered and chiseled into the stone. So we could speak of them as being like a sort of handwritten form of hieroglyphs, a kind of cursive form, but they still retain clearly, if you can read these things, the right shapes to be read as hieroglyphic signs. Along with very complicated texts like that, of course, hieroglyphs were also used for very, very simple and short inscriptions as well, particularly in the early times. So this is, I'm afraid, not perhaps the most brilliant example because it's quite badly damaged, but this is a First Dynasty jar label now in the British Museum. And this is the kind of example of an inscribed surface where you have very few hieroglyphic signs actually, and not all sort of written as if together in one single continuous text, but rather sort of disjointed individual words. But the sense that's conveyed here is very simple. It simply reflects the contents of whatever was in this jar. So my point here is just to say that, you know, hieroglyphs could be used for extremely sacred and complex funerary or religious texts, but equally they might just say there was some wine in this, and the wine was made here and on this particular date or whatever. The hieroglyphs, of course, it's important to remember, are not the only script in use in Egypt. It was the earliest script, and for a while it was the only script. But eventually, other scripts evolved from it. So the first of these is hieratic. The word hieratic comes from the Greek hieratikos, which from itself comes from hierateia, meaning priests or priesthood, of the priests. In this sense, the name isn't entirely appropriate, because it sort of suggests that hieratic was only in use again for religious purposes or by priests, when in actual fact it became the script that was used for everything other than the very most sacred texts that were carved in hieroglyphs on temple walls or on objects that were to be placed in situations like a tomb along with the remains of the deceased individual. So hieratic could be used for everything from, yes, in some cases, religious texts on papyrus, but also much more prosaic stuff like the kinds of label that we saw in an earlier slide there, or tax receipts, letters, the kinds of everyday life documents that we have from places like Deir Medina. This is a papyrus known as the Abbot Papyrus of the 20th dynasty. It's one of the tomb robbery papyri group, which gives you an idea of how the script appears. It does derive from hieroglyphs, so some of the signs are recognizably approximately the same shape, the same form as the hieroglyphic signs. In other cases, the script has evolved so far away from the hieroglyphic originals that it's very difficult to see the correspondence. So being able to read hieratic is usually a kind of a more advanced, it's like a sort of the next level above being able to read hieroglyphs. It requires a bit more experience. Hieratic, of course, was also written by scribes by hand in ink, usually on papyrus, and the idea was that it enabled the scribe to write much more quickly than hieroglyphs could be written, even on ink. You know, drawing a very beautiful owl, or you know, a man in exactly the right position holding the right thing, etc., you know, could take you a while, whereas the hieratic forms evolved so that the script could be written very quickly. But just like our own handwriting, individual scribes develop their own sort of style. So there are rules governing the forms that meant that if you could read the hieratic scripts, then you know you ought to be able to read one text over another. But the basic form could vary quite a lot, and it's possible to tell one scribe's writing from another, just as it's possible to identify our own personal handwriting styles from one another. That, of course, makes it a little bit trickier to read here and there. Hieratic was also used for the writing of literary texts, and a lot of the literary texts actually that have survived from ancient Egypt, in fact, take the form of copies made by scribes in training. Literary texts were often used for this purpose. I couldn't resist including this particular example of a literary text written in hieratic on papyrus. This is Papyrus Salier II, which is a copy of the so-called Satire of the Trades, a text that discusses all the various different occupations, the ways in which you might spend your days earning a living in ancient Egypt, and it favors the profession of scribe, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the medium. here, and it includes some great phrases like "set your heart on books, a scribe at whatever post in town, he will not suffer in it. As he fills another's need, he will not lack rewards." So be a scribe, folks. That's a good thing to do in ancient Egypt. So hieratic is the first of the scripts to evolve as a quick and easy administrative script from hieroglyphic. In later times, hieratic branches off into two new variants, one in the south of the country in Upper Egypt and one in the north in Lower Egypt. And that phenomenon of a sort of split itself is an interesting way for us to be able to tell the extent to which the country split in the first millennium. So in the south, the new script is referred to by us, by Egyptologists, as abnormal hieratic. It is distinct from earlier hieratic. And that was in use in particular during the 25th and 26th dynasties. Meanwhile, in the north, another variant develops, which we have come to refer to as demotic, from the ancient Greek demotikos, demotes, demos, meaning common people, that sort of thing. So this is thought to be, just to use the name, the script of the common people. This could equally apply to hieratic, but it just so happens it's the convention that we've come to use demotic for this later form. And in fact, abnormal hieratic, the Upper Egyptian variant, doesn't last for very long. Later abnormal hieratic texts come to include demotic forms, and eventually demotic supplants abnormal hieratic. So abnormal hieratic was relatively short-lived, and there are not a huge number of texts still surviving. And as a result of that, there are very few scholars in the world who read it. I certainly don't. There's maybe only a handful in this country that can read it, maybe 2 or 3. I'm not sure if it's even as many as that. Across the world, a couple of dozen maybe. There aren't so many demotists either who can read demotic, but certainly there are more of them than can read abnormal hieratic. And demotic remains the principal administrative language down into the first couple of centuries of the current era. Alongside it, however, Greek, particularly from the time of Alexander the Great and the establishment of a new line beginning with Alexander's general Ptolemy Soter, the first of the Ptolemaic dynasty, right at the end of the 4th century BC. At that point, of course, Alexandria comes to be established as a new capital, or shortly after that, once it was fully built. And Alexandria, the new capital, was principally a Greek city, and the elite from the time the Ptolemies established themselves were Greek as well. So Greek becomes the script of the elite and of the administration, or the administrative elite as well. So from this point onwards, the last 3 centuries BC, Greek also is well established in Egypt as a working script. So we have, of course, many texts surviving in this script as well. The last of the major scripts that we should be thinking about is Coptic. And that word, by the way, just to complete the set in terms of the etymology, that word derives from an ancient Egyptian phrase, in fact. So the ancient Egyptian phrase is Hut Ka Ptah, the house of the Ka of Ptah, the house of Ptah, which really means the temple of Ptah. And the god Ptah, the creator god Ptah, was the patron deity of Memphis, and his cult center was in the center of the city of Memphis, where there was a great temple. That word, which we clumsily pronounce Hut Ka Ptah, was probably pronounced something more like Hikuptah, certainly in later times. And Hikuptah came to be a name not just for the temple, but for the whole of the city of Memphis, and eventually, by extension, the whole of the country. And it's for this reason that to the Greeks, the whole of the country came to be known as Aiguptos. That comes from Hikupta. So Hikupta becomes Aiguptos in the Greek. And it's from that Greek word, derived from the Egyptian, that we get the word gyptios in Coptic. And that is the Coptic word used for Egyptian. So gyptios, from which we get our modern word Copt, simply means Egyptian. And Coptic itself is a script which is basically formed of Greek characters, the Greek alphabet, with the addition of, I think it's 7 signs from demotic, which are required because the Greek characters didn't write all of the sounds that you needed to be able to convey the Egyptian language. So it's a combination. It's mostly Greek characters with a few demotic additions. So it's a kind of Egyptian form of Greek, if you like. We tend to think, because at the time this came into use, certainly by the 3rd century of the current era, by the time this became established as the last script to write, the last form of the native Egyptian language, Egypt was also becoming Christian. And in modern times, we refer to the minority of people in Egypt who are Christian as Copts, Coptic Christians. So we tend to think of Copticism as being Christian, but in actual fact, in terms of the script and the language, it's more properly the last stage of Egyptian, whether pagan or Christian. So this is also very important, and something else that's very important for the decipherment of hieroglyphs is that thanks to Coptic using Greek characters and this handful of demotic, the words are written phonetically, and a lot of those words in Coptic are survivals from earlier forms of the Egyptian language, and that is often our way into understanding how to pronounce ancient Egyptian words. So as we'll see, we know that the Egyptian word for sun is Re, or sometimes Ra, because that is the way it's written in Coptic. Doesn't give us the same, the earlier forms of Egyptian hieroglyphics, etc., don't give us the same amount of help in terms of how to pronounce that word. We understand that from the Coptic. And Coptic, by the way, survives not as a kind of everyday spoken language, but it is still the language of the liturgy in Christian services in Egypt, Coptic Christian services. So in that sense, the ancient Egyptian language survives, sort of, but only in that very specific context in Coptic churches. So the ancient Egyptian language, the hieroglyphic scripts, would eventually disappear, as we know. This is the very last surviving hieroglyphic inscription. It comes from Philae. It's inscribed on the walls of a gateway of the Emperor Hadrian, but it is an informal addition to the decoration in that gateway. So if you look at the photograph on the right-hand side here, you can see the later, indeed very latest hieroglyphic inscription highlighted. Above it, a rather more formal raised relief scene of a series of offering bearers with some raised relief hieroglyphs in and around the same part of the wall. The later addition here, which you see most clearly on the left-hand side, is a sort of rather untidy sunk relief figure of the god Mandulis, whose worship was really concentrated in the south of Egypt and in this area around the First Cataract at Philae, but also further south in the First to Second Cataract region. And the inscription was dedicated by a priest, Nes Meta Archem, dedicated to the god Mandulis, who we see in this figure wearing this very elaborate crown, dedicated for all time and eternity. And the inscription is dated to year 394 of the current era, 394 AD. It doesn't tell us a great deal. Interestingly, though, there are a few mistakes in the spelling and grammar, in the syntax, in the way that the inscription is composed, suggesting that even Nes Meta Archem, or whichever scribe it was who executed this inscription for him, was maybe sort of losing the grip on how to write in hieroglyphs, or how to write ancient Egyptian. So that in itself is a sort of sign that the mastery of the language and script was disappearing as it was being replaced by Coptic and perhaps Greek as well. And indeed, in fact, this inscription dates to a couple of years after the point at which pagan temples like this one elsewhere in Egypt had been closed by an order of the Emperor Theodosius in 391 to 2 of the current era. So by this time, the Roman Empire had become officially Christian, of course, and Egypt, as a part of that empire, was also officially Christian. And many people would already have converted to Christianity by this point, but not everybody. There were still pagans who wished to worship the traditional gods. And because Christianity arrives in Egypt from the north and sort of trickles down the Nile Valley, Christianity, spreads through Egypt that way. It tends to be the south where paganism remained strongest. And for this reason, Philae was given a kind of exemption. There were rather more pagans who wanted to worship here in and around the area, and also in the first to second cataract region, where there were not only Egyptians but other groups, typically sort of nomadic groups, who also wished to continue worshipping the traditional pagan gods. So Philae is the kind of last outpost, if you like, of the pagan Egyptian religion. So it's not surprising, really, that we would get the last hieroglyphic inscription here as well. I always find this a very kind of fascinating and also sort of poignant inscription. It's almost like the sort of the last dying breath of a certain aspect of ancient Egypt, if you like. So to the decipherment. The story that I'm going to tell over the next sort of half an hour or so is mostly one of the rediscovery of the way to read hieroglyphic inscriptions and to understand the Egyptian language of European scholars, and it's all a part of the European kind of rediscovery of ancient Egypt. But I can't go ahead with that without mentioning that, thanks to scholars such as Akasha El-Daily, probably the leading scholar in this field, we are now much more aware that it is not the case that from the moment the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost, whenever that was, in the first few centuries of the current era, up until the point that Jean Francois Champollion cracks the code, if you like. It's not as though, other than the early efforts of European scholars, there was a complete lack of effort and endeavor to try to read these inscriptions. We were, until really Akasha El-Daily and others started to work on the material left behind by a series of medieval Arab scholars, and to publish the results of their studies so that we could all become aware of it. We were all really ignorant of the efforts of these people in a different part of the world. This is about as good an example as I could find of an attempt by one of these medieval Arab scholars to document a hieroglyphic inscription. And this is from a manuscript now in the British Library, and it is an attempt to make a copy of, recognizably, a stela of the Middle Kingdom pharaoh Amenemhat II. of the 12th dynasty. So what we're looking at here, although the copy is made very much in the author's own sort of style, it's not a facsimile copy, but we can recognize an enclosure here with a series of hieroglyphic signs inside it. So this is the same kind of serech that we saw on the Narmer palette. Inside a series of recognizable hieroglyphic signs, a dotted H, coil of rope, a neb, semicircular sign. There's a bird within. There's what's probably a Horus falcon at the top of the serech, as we would expect. And a whole series of other hieroglyphs and other signs, some of which are recognizable. Down at the bottom right-hand corner, we can read this little sort of wigwam type sign is we would read as D or er D, meaning given or giving. There's an Ankh sign here, life. Oops, pardon me. And then this combination of a serpent, a semicircular T sign, and this low flat sign. Read together, those mean something like eternity. And this is the classic phrase that comes at the end of short royal inscriptions like this: given life or giving life for eternity. So a recognizable copy of a hieroglyphic inscription made by somebody called Abu el-Qasim el-Iraqi, one of these medieval Arab scholars, and there are a whole series of these, as I say, who made it their business to document Egyptian sites and monuments, to document various aspects of the culture, including hieroglyphic inscriptions, and to make attempts to try to read the script. They weren't entirely successful in this, but the important point is to recognize that it is not as though no one had any interest in this kind of thing until the last few centuries worth of European scholars in modern times. So I just want to acknowledge that without really going into detail. If you want to know more about that kind of thing, the best place to start is Okasha El-Daly's book, Egyptology, the Missing Millennium, which has really blazed a trail in our subject in enlightening us about this group of scholars. Having said all that, this is, as I say, as far as this lecture goes, the focus is going to be on European scholars, and I'm not going to deal with all of them, not by any means, but just a few favorites. We're going to start with this guy, Athanasius Kircher, who is a kind of polymath, Jesuit scholar in the service from time to time of the Pope. He was interested in ancient Egypt and hieroglyphic inscriptions. Very much influenced by Neoplatonist ideas about the idea that there was a kind of universal wisdom which had been handed down from ancient cultures, including particularly ancient Egypt, with the wisdom about the nature of the universe and existence and fundamental things like that. And he wanted to be able to see in hieroglyphic inscriptions, perhaps fully aware of the meaning of the word hieroglyphics, deriving from these ancient Greek words, sacred carvings. He wanted to see this universal wisdom about the nature of the universe in these texts. And so his approach to reading inscriptions such as those on the obelisks that he found around and about in Rome, where he was based for a time, he set about using this approach to try to read the texts. He was particularly taken with this object here, which we see in the form of a line drawing of the full inscribed surface on the upper right here, and in a photograph of a portion of that surface on the left-hand side here. As you can see from the photograph, perhaps the object is made of inscribed bronze. It's known as the Mensa Isiaca, or the Bembine tablet. It's now in the Museo Egizio in Turin. The Egyptian Museum didn't exist at the time Kircher was looking at this, but this object was already in one of the collections in Italy. He and a small number of other scholars in Europe at this time were beginning to gather together drawings and descriptions of the relatively small number of Egyptian objects and monuments that were already in European collections. And he did a great deal of this work, copying inscriptions and trying to understand them. So he used this in particular as the basis for his attempts to try to understand the language. And he was in particular taken by this part of the frieze of hieroglyphs that runs around the edge of the Benbain tablet. I'm sorry this is such a blurry image, but it's actually quite a small detail, so I needed to blow up the drawing that I had. As it says here, he wanted to read into the hieroglyphs this earliest idea of this earliest theology that came from wisdom texts, in particular the Corpus Hermeticum, a series of texts originating in Egypt, supposedly conveying wisdom that came from Hermes, and prior to him from Thoth, the Egyptian god Thoth. And what he wanted to see in particular in this group of hieroglyphic signs was something fundamental about the nature of the universe. So he saw the sun disk, the sun, the image of the sun in inscriptions like this one, as being the soul of the whole of the world. And he believed that this oval, kind of at the shoulder of this strange scarab beetle with a human head, this oval with concentric circles inside it, concentric oval shapes, as the planetary orbits. So these are the planets orbiting the sun. The human head of the scarab beetle is the sun itself. The disk above it represents the moon. And then, although it's a bit difficult to see here, there's a cross within the crescent of the moon here, which he wanted to see as representing the four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. Great. The problem with this is that the Benbain tablet is not even really Egyptian. It is a Roman Egyptianizing object. So although it is decorated with what look like Egyptian figures, wearing Egyptian headgear, we have mostly human figures, but occasionally a human figure with an animal head. So there's recognizably a Thoth here, seated Thoth with an ibis head. There are falcons and other birds of various kinds in the sort of appropriate position, one wing outstretched in the case of this vulture-like bird here. It all looks quite Egyptian, but in fact, it's as I say, it's a kind of Egyptianizing scene, executed by somebody who couldn't read hieroglyphs and didn't really appreciate the importance of recreating them accurately. So what purport to be hieroglyphic signs in the short text in and around the figures, and in the much longer text around the edge, are actually approximations of hieroglyphic signs, some of which do sort of correspond to hieroglyphs, others of which don't, all of them arranged higgledy-piggledy, so nothing makes any sense at all. So there is no sense here at all for Kircher to discover. So sadly, although he expended all this effort in trying to read this meaning into texts like this one, and others which were genuinely Egyptian, his approach was wrong, and he was doomed from the start in using this text, which had nothing to do with the real hieroglyphic script and the real Egyptian language, sadly for him. Not very much progress was made following this, really, up until the point of the early 19th century, beginning with, as so much in Egyptology does, the invasion of the country in 1798 by the French Emperor Napoleon and his armies. You'll know that they invaded in July 1798, very quickly defeated the incumbent ruling Mamluk class, chased their leaders around the country, established themselves in control of Cairo, where they set about establishing institutions like a base for scholars, a printing press so that they could circulate propaganda, etc., etc. They ultimately weren't successful. Of course, their navy was destroyed shortly after this. by Admiral Lord Nelson's fleet off the coast of Alexandria. The army stayed in Egypt for a couple of years, but was eventually ousted. But of course, Napoleon brought with his armies a corps of scholars who were there to make a grand description of the country, Description de l'Égypte, a record of the natural landscape, flora and fauna, and the built environment, divided into more modern buildings and ancient sites and monuments. And this Description de l'Égypte was by far and away the most comprehensive and accurate record made up until this point of ancient Egyptian sites and monuments. So it was hugely useful and important in its time, and remains, I'm sure you've heard me say this before, very useful to this day. And along with descriptions, maps, plans, general views of sites and monuments, the scholars made what were, up until this point, the most accurate facsimile copies of the decoration on temple and tomb walls, including scenes like this one. This is actually a scene of Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, shaking a sistrum before the goddess Ra Tawi from the now destroyed birth house at Armant. One of the reasons the Description has proven to be so useful is because they captured records of monuments which would subsequently vanish. So this doesn't exist anymore, this scene, sadly. And although the scholars weren't able to read the texts, they weren't familiar with the hieroglyphic signs to that extent, the signs are copied accurately enough that they were legible. And this had the effect of exposing the fact that there was all this massive text that we couldn't read out there, but also providing scholars back home in France, Britain, and elsewhere who were trying to get to grips with the hieroglyphic text with masses of new material, and that was very important. They also made a great discovery, as you will no doubt know, here at a fortress which they called Fort Julian. This is from an engraving made a couple of years after their initial invasion in 1803. This was published in William Whitman's book, Travels in Turkey, Asia Minor, Syria. The title goes on and on and on and on, far too long for my slide. Fort Julian was on the banks of a branch of the Nile along the Mediterranean coast, or just inland from the Mediterranean coast on the western side of the Delta region, at the town of Rashid. We know Rashid better by the Europeanized form of the name Rosetta. And the French armies were renovating Fort Julian, a pre-existing Arab fortress, which they intended to use for their own purposes. So they were strengthening it so that it could be used as a defensible outpost for their own armies. And in so doing, in July 1799, Lieutenant Pierre-Francois Bouchard noticed in the foundations of the fortress that an inscribed stone was present. So it had, the inscription itself was clearly not of any interest to the people building the fort a few centuries beforehand. They simply wanted this large lump of stone to help with the foundations of this new building. The French realized that the inscription might make this rather an important stone, and so it was removed and absorbed into the collection that Napoleon and his army and savants were building, with a view to shipping off the most important portable objects for the glorification of the French nation in the national collection in the Louvre. This, of course, is now perhaps the most famous Egyptian object of them all, the Rosetta Stone. And it's important not just because it was clearly much older than Fort Julian, but because its inscription divides into three. It is inscribed in hieroglyphic along the top, in the middle in demotic, the cursive form, the cursive script used to write the Egyptian language, and at the bottom an inscription in Greek capital letters. The importance of this, of course, being that the Greek could be read, where the hieroglyphic and demotic couldn't. And the final part of the Greek inscription confirms what all would-be translators of the Egyptian would have been hoping. The inscription reads, "This decree shall be inscribed on a stela of hard stone in sacred," meaning hieroglyphic, in native, meaning demotic, and Greek characters, and set up in each of the first, second, and third rank temples beside the image of the ever-living king, King Ptolemy V. So this seems to confirm that indeed the inscription is the same in all three scripts. So, given that the Greek could be read, scholars could then set about trying to find correspondences in terms of individual words between the Greek inscription and the other two, the demotic and the hieroglyphic. Incidentally, aside from its greatest importance, which is in providing the key to the decipherment, the Rosetta Stone is an important monument in its own right. It would have been even if it was only inscribed in hieroglyphic. It's one of a series of decrees that were issued during the Ptolemaic period. They're quite characteristic of this period, which essentially record benefactions made to priests by the king and honors bestowed on the king by the priesthood in return. There was a very particular relationship between the ruling king and the rest of the country at this time. The Ptolemies, of course, are foreign. They did a pretty good job of integrating themselves into Egypt and making themselves proper pharaohs of the country. But they never lost their foreignness. Cleopatra VII, the very last of the line, at the end of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, was believed to be the first to speak Egyptian, the Egyptian language. They otherwise spoke Greek. Alexandria was essentially a Greek city. Their arrival brought with it lots of Greek influence and wealthy Greeks into the elite in Egypt. And when times were tough, the Egyptian native population were not slow to revolt against their Ptolemaic overlords. So the Ptolemies survived for 3 centuries, but it wasn't an easy and harmonious relationship between the two groups throughout that time. And these decrees, I think, sort of speak to that, this idea that occasionally the kings would do something very nice for the population, or for the priesthood in particular, and the priests would thank them by recognizing the role of the Ptolemies within Egyptian religion. And there are a whole series of these decrees. Probably the best known, this isn't all of them that I've given here, but the best known are probably the Decree of Canopus of 239 of the reign of Ptolemy III. There are 4 copies of this, in 3 of them in 3 scripts. The most recent of these to be discovered was found at Bubastis in 2004. I'm not sure how many scripts that's written in. I don't know a lot about that one, but the others certainly in the 3 scripts, demotic, hieroglyphic, and Greek. There are then 2 decrees referred to as the Decree of Memphis. The earlier one of the time of Ptolemy, the 4th, dates to 217 BC. There are 2 copies of this, again, both written in 3 scripts, discovered in 1902 and 1923. And then the Rosetta Stone records a 2nd Decree of Memphis, this time from slightly later, 196 BC, in the reign of Ptolemy V. There are 3 copies of this. The Rosetta Stone, another stela referred to as the Nubeira stela, which was discovered in the late 19th century. And a few decades after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, it was recognized that a part of the hieroglyphic text is also inscribed on the walls of the temple of Philae. So in fact, the Rosetta Stone is by no means the only trilingual text of this kind from this period that we have, but it was the first of these to be discovered, and so that is really why it comes to be so important for modern scholarship. Had any of these others been discovered first, it may well have been that they would have provided the key. It's just that the Rosetta Stone was the first one to be discovered. This particular decree records that Ptolemy V had reduced or abolished taxes for the army and the general population, including the priesthood. So this is the king doing a nice thing for his people, and in return, the priesthood, who are in charge of such things, recognize the cult of Ptolemy V. So as pharaoh, according to the way the Egyptian worldview works, the pharaoh is semi-divine and responsible for being the intermediary between the world of men and the world of gods. And so this is recognition that Ptolemy V is indeed that legitimate pharaoh, and confirms that he is able to perform that role as the go-between men and gods. And as part of the recognition of his cult, the decree says that a statue of Ptolemy V should be set up in various temples up and down the country in the most prominent possible position. And of course, it also says that this decree and a record of it should be set up in those places as well, hence the Rosetta Stone and the Nubeira stela, etc. So that's great. But as we've seen, the most important thing really about the Rosetta Stone, certainly for our story here, is that the three scripts allowed for the beginning of the process of deciphering the language using the Greek, which could be read to look for, and then using that to look for correspondences between words in that inscription and words in the Egyptian. So two of the first to make use of the Rosetta Stone text and to start trying to look for these correspondences were these two scholars, Sylvester de Sacy in France and Johann David Åkerblad, I think in Sweden. I'm not absolutely sure about that. I think in Sweden. They set about trying to find signs in the demotic which corresponded to the names in the Greek. So they were very reasonably thinking that names of people and places which cropped up in the Greek inscription would be written in the same way. They would have this approximately the same sound values, at least, in the other two texts. So whereas, for example, if you take the word for, I don't know, a flower in the Greek language, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to have the same sound value in the Egyptian language, whereas the name Ptolemy you might well expect to be exactly the same in the Greek as in the demotic and the hieroglyphic. So they were looking for those names which they expected would be repeated in all three scripts. And they seem to have some success in this, and they thought that they were able to see a certain correspondence in a number of individual signs between the Greek characters and individual characters specifically in the demotic. And because of this, they suggested that demotic, like Greek, was alphabetic. In other words, it was composed of a certain limited number of signs, each of which conveyed a certain sound. When all strung together, those signs enabled the vocalizing of particular words. That's how our own alphabet works, it's how the Greek alphabet works, and they were theorizing that this is how demotic worked as well. Following the long-held belief that hieroglyphic was a purely pictorial language, so according to this view, the individual hieroglyphic signs, which of course are essentially little pictograms, little pictures of recognizable things, birds and animals and men and women and various other aspects of nature, the sun, a mountain, etc. They didn't convey sounds at all. They symbolized the things that they were, the meaning of which they were trying to convey. So de Sacy and Åkerblad suggested that demotic was alphabetic, like Greek and like our own script. Hieroglyphic was purely symbolic, and there was no kind of overlap between the two. So just to try and help convey what I mean here, and in the hope that this isn't just going to be more confusing, a purely alphabetic, phonetic writing of this curious phrase, which I've adopted here because it was easy to spell out in hieroglyphs. The man walks to the elephant is written in our script and in the English language in this way. So the characters here convey the sounds which we need to spell out the words "the man walks to the elephant." An entirely symbolic writing of that same phrase in hieroglyphs, as here, might involve these three signs: a man or the man, so the indefinite or definite article omitted here, walks, pair of walking legs, to the preposition and definite article omitted, elephant. So in this way, I hope it's clear the difference between a kind of alphabetic phonetic system and a purely symbolic system. And this is how de Sacy and Oqueblad understood demotic on the left and hieroglyphic on the right. Unfortunately, they were not right in making this very stark distinction between the two. But they were wrong because it's slightly more complicated than that, as we'll see. But de Sacy did suggest that foreign names, i.e. names that are foreign to Egyptian, non-Egyptian names, non-Egyptian words, such as Ptolemy, Alexander, etc., might be written phonetically in hieroglyphs, as foreign words were in the Chinese script. So in this case, because these words had no meaning, no place in the Egyptian language, the only way that Egyptian could write these words, Ptolemy, Alexander, etc., would be to use characters to convey the sounds of those words. If that was right, then in fact hieroglyphic would be, in those cases, a little bit of a mixture of symbols and phonetic signs. The next person to begin to get to grips with this and to make advances was the Englishman Thomas Young, another polymath, probably best known for various advances he made in hard sciences, particularly physics, particularly to do with waves of light, I think. He began working on the problem of reading hieroglyphs from 1814 onwards, and his approach was the same as those who'd gone before him. He was taking the known Greek text, and comparing it with the demotic. And he began to recognize physical similarities in the forms of the hieroglyphic and demotic signs, interestingly enough. And this began to give him the idea that the demotic and hieroglyphic might not be totally and utterly separate, but actually might be related to one another. And of course, he was right in that. Demotic evolved over a very long period of time from hieroglyphic. So some of the signs in the demotic actually originate in hieroglyphic forms. He also noted, and this is crucial, that the hieroglyphic signs could not be made to correspond to the signs of any alphabet. So this sort of confirms that idea that hieroglyph is certainly not purely alphabetic. It's at least partly pictorial. And on this basis, he deduces that if hieroglyphs and demotic were related, as he had begun to think that they were, then they must probably both be a mixture of both alphabetic and symbolic signs. And he was right. So de Sacy and Oqueblad's idea that the one was alphabetic, the other one was pictorial, and there was no connection between the two, this was wrong. And this is a great leap forward that Young makes at this point. He also followed the earlier suggestion that where groups of hieroglyphic signs were enclosed in a kind of ring, the signs inside read the names of kings or gods. And there were a number of these in the hieroglyphic text. You can see some of them above here. So there's a ring here, another one here, and another one here. And these rings, which are like elongated ovals, are roughly the same shape as the cartridges that were used in the rifles of Napoleon's armies. And the French word for those little cartridges is cartouche. And for that reason, we Egyptologists call these rings enclosing the names of kings and gods cartouches. So Young follows this suggestion, which also, of course, would mean that of the cartouches in the Rosetta Stone inscription in the hieroglyphic, 6 of them must contain the name of the king Ptolemy, which appears 6 times in the Greek text. And he noted that of the cartouches in the hieroglyphic inscription, 2 were very similar in that they both contained the same set of 8 signs, but that one of them then also included a further half a dozen or so signs. So there's a kind of a longer and shorter version of this same cartouche. And this, in fact, is the cartouche of King Ptolemy. Young proposed that the extra signs were the epithet, which is translated into the Greek as living forever, beloved of Ptah. So that is added to the name Ptolemy in some instances in the inscription, but not in others. And the remaining signs must therefore spell out the name Ptolemy. And he was right about this. And this allowed him to see, based on the idea that this is the name Ptolemy and the name is spelt out phonetically, he deduced that the signs involved in writing the name Ptolemy had individually these values. So there was a P, a T. He believed that this rope sign, pardon me, this rope sign here is, he said, not essentially necessary. This recumbent lion is a low or ol sound. This 2 parallel lines connected at the left-hand end, ma or just an M. This double sign here has the value E, and finally this tall, narrow sign, osh or os. So altogether he would be reading Ptolemy-osh or something like that, not a million miles away from Ptolemy or Ptolemies. At this point, or around this time, the most famous of all the scholars involved in the decipherment comes onto the scene. This is, of course, Jean Francois Champollion, not a polymath, but a specialist linguist, very proficient in an enormous number of both modern and ancient languages by this point. The 2 of them corresponded, initially cordially, but a rivalry quickly developed between the 2 of them, not least because they didn't take the same view of the way in which the script and the language should be interpreted. Champollion, in fact, did not initially accept Young's proposal that some parts of hieroglyphic were phonetic. In other words, hieroglyphic was a mixture of phonetic and symbolic characters. He didn't believe that this was correct, but he eventually came round to that idea, and this was key. So you will probably be aware that while Champollion gets most of the credit for the decipherment, he was building on the work of earlier scholars, including Young. In fact, in this important way, Champollion initially was entirely wrong about hieroglyphic being a mixture of phonetic and symbolic characters, but it's his coming around to this that eventually leads to his momentous discovery. At this point, we need to bring this obelisk into the story. This is an obelisk that I photographed while making a documentary with Tristan Hughes of History Hit, who you see here, pointing out the obelisk in case its position wasn't obvious to you. The obelisk now stands in the gardens of what's now a National Trust property, Kingston Lacey in Dorset. It was the seat of the Banks family, and in the early 19th century, it was the home of William John Banks, who had a great interest in ancient Egypt, Egyptology, in the decipherment. He corresponded with Young, visited Egypt a couple of times, and was one of a series of scholars who at that time were making comprehensive surveys of Egyptian sites and monuments with a view to improving on the Napoleonic Description de l'Egypte. but also with a particular focus on copying inscriptions that could then be sent back to scholars in Europe, in particular, in Banks's case, to Thomas Young, so that he would have more and more and more material to try to apply his ideas to. And this obelisk is among the most important of the monuments discovered around this time. It was discovered at Philae. It was claimed by both the French and the British, but it was eventually removed for Banks by Belzoni, and eventually made its way to Dorset in the southwest of England and was erected in the grounds, and that's where it is to this day. It is important because not only does it bear a hieroglyphic inscription on the obelisk itself, but also a Greek inscription on the base. And I'm sorry, this is it's more or less impossible to see anything of the Greek inscription, but it more or less covers the surface of the red granite base here, which is rather worn, unfortunately, today. And the lighting conditions, certainly the day I was there, made it absolutely impossible really to see anything. You'll just have to trust me. There is Greek here, and of course the assumption made by Banks and others was that the text of the hieroglyphic inscription on the obelisk and the text of the Greek inscription on the base were the same in two different languages. That was the working assumption, proved to be correct. Banks realized that the Greek inscription contained only two royal names, Ptolemy, which by this point could already more or less be read, and Cleopatra. So if this was correct, if they were correct in this, and in the two scripts wrote the same text, and that Ptolemy could correctly be read, then the other cartouches, the ones that were not Ptolemy, must be those of Cleopatra. So Champollion set to work on this, and noticed that 5 of the signs in the cartouche he believed wrote the name Cleopatra also appeared in that of Ptolemy, specifically the P, this O sound, which in fact Young wasn't sure had any phonetic value, but in fact it does. The recumbent animal, which is the L part, and then the reed leaf, which appears twice in the Ptolemy cartouche, once in Cleopatra. It's a kind of E sound. Champollion could then start taking a guess at the value of the other signs, excuse me. And once he'd done that, he could then start applying all of the signs in these two cartouches to other names as well. And this allowed him quickly to read other royal names: Alexandros, Caesar, Autocrata, which is the name often given to Roman emperor pharaohs in the Roman period, Berenike. And of course, with the reading of each one of these cartouches, Champollion was adding to the list of hieroglyphic signs whose phonetic values were known. And this was giving him a better and better and better and better chance of being able to read at least the sounds of words in other parts of Egyptian texts. And this led him in September 1822, to a point at which he felt able to announce that he had a new system for deciphering hieroglyphic inscriptions. His knowledge was still by no means perfect. He absolutely could not read all inscriptions. It's still the case, of course, even today in 2023, that our knowledge of the scripts and language is imperfect. But Champollion had got himself to a certain point where he felt able to say, I've cracked it. So he gave a lecture at the French Academy of Inscriptions. In the following month, this lecture was published in the form of a letter to Monsieur Dacier, the Secrétaire Perpetuel, perpetual secretary of the Academy, in which he sets out his new system. It's for this reason, publication of the Lettre à Monsieur Dacier in October 1822, that we think of 1822 as being the point at which we were able again to read hieroglyphic inscriptions. I in fact think, arguably, this is a little bit premature, because, as I say, Champollion's knowledge of the language is still very much imperfect at this point, and he would continue to improve rapidly in the months that followed. In fact, at this point, Champollion was still laboring under the belief that hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, except when they were used to write foreign words such as the names Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Alexander, etc. And he wasn't right in this, but the reading of two further cartouches writing not foreign names, the names of Ptolemaic and Roman rulers, but earlier Egyptian names would convince him that, in fact, hieroglyphs were a mixture of symbols and phonetic signs throughout. This is the first of these two Egyptian names, which occurred very frequently in the inscriptions in the temple of the Great Temple of Abu Simbel, which had only been opened for the first time a few years earlier by Belzoni in 1817. Absolutely sensational achievement, rock-cut architecture, inscribed throughout, with this cartouche appearing very frequently. It's composed of 4 signs in its simplest form anyway. The last 2 of the signs, reading left to right here, were both known from the Ptolemy cartouche to have the phonetic value S. So it seemed that whatever name this was, it ended with 2 S's, a long S or a perhaps with a missing vowel between the 2, ses or sas or sis, something like that. Champollion then made one of these great leaps of the imagination that characterize great intellectual leaps forward. He theorized that the circular sign at the left-hand end represented the sun. Not a bad suggestion. And he knew from Coptic, we mentioned this earlier, that the word for sun in Coptic, and he theorized perhaps also in earlier Egyptian, had the value Re or Ra. If that was right, then this name began with Ra or Re and ended with Ses. So he started to look for royal names, names of kings of Egypt, which began with Ra and ended with Ses. What name could this possibly be? Well, Manetho's king list provided him with the name Ramesses, which of course is the right name. In that case, Champollion was able to deduce that this sign in the middle must have the value M, or Mes, in fact, as we now believe. So altogether, Ra, Me, Ses, Ramesses. He was then able to apply what he was learning rapidly to another cartouche, which again, in its simplest form, in this case, is composed just of 3 signs. So again, reading left to right, the second and third were known to him from the Ramesses cartouche as being read Mes. He also knew that this first sign of an ibis bird on a perch of some kind was known to be a symbol of the god Thoth, Tehot. So he was then looking for a king, Tehotmes. And of course, Manetho, again, with his king list, provides the name of the 18th dynasty king, Thutmose. So these were both the names of Egyptian kings, apparently spelt out in hieroglyphs, but phonetically. And this confirms for Champollion what Young had been arguing years earlier, which is that the hieroglyphic script is a mixture both of symbols and phonetic signs. And in some ways, I think this is really the great breakthrough. And Champollion made this these leaps forward in 1823. So in some ways, I think this year, 2023, is perhaps more appropriately the 200th anniversary of the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Anyway, you can set that anniversary whenever you want, really, because our knowledge of the language has been improving more or less since this point, and will continue to improve into the future. But this was a great leap forward, and of course, it meant that for the first time, inscriptions on monuments like the Great Temple of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel could be identified as having been built at that point. And thanks to the king list of Manetho, of course, scholars like Champollion, Egyptologists around Europe and beyond, had a sequence, albeit a flawed one, of kings. And so once those names in Manetho's list could be matched to the names appearing on monuments, the monuments could then be put in sequence. The floodgates were really about to open at this point. And monuments like this one, which up until the point at which the names could be read, had to be identified as they had been in classical times. So this was thought by classical writers to be an image of the younger Memnon, Memnon being a kind of mythical king from the Homeric epic poetry. This was thought to be an image of that Ethiopian king. Thanks to being able to read the name, we could understand that this also is Ramesses II. So where actually the name Memnon still attaches itself to monuments in Egypt, such as the Colossi of Memnon, we know that more properly those are images of Amenhotep III. And all of these other monuments could begin to be identified with the historic kings from Manetho's king list. And in 1828-9, Champollion led the Franco-Tuscan expedition to Egypt, his first visit to Egypt a few years after he'd cracked the code, as it were. And this was really the first of these great expeditions that went with the knowledge of how to read the inscriptions. And so his survey of the sites and monuments, armed with his knowledge of how inscriptions should be read, of course, was also a great leap forward. And in some ways, you know, this is the birth of Egyptology. As I say, the floodgates were open. Suddenly, we were able to read meaning into these inscriptions. So we're nearly at the end. We've had a look at how the language is decoded, and I thought just for the last few minutes, what we should do is look at how to read an inscription, how we go about breaking things down. So I thought for this we would use a name that will be familiar to all of you, the name of the boy king Tutankhamun, and I thought we would use this object, is cartouche-shaped box, which was discovered by Howard Carter in the tomb in KV 62. It has the Carter object number 269. It is, as I say, a cartouche-shaped box. It was included in the exhibition that travelled to Paris and then to London. It was in London when COVID appeared in all of our lives, and went back to Egypt after that point. Unfortunately, I think it was due to go to Sydney and somewhere in the US as well. Anyway, you may be familiar with this object either from Cairo or from elsewhere. The lid is essentially a giant cartouche with the hieroglyphic signs that make up the king's name, plus an epithet, as we'll see, on a gilded background. Each one of the signs created of inlays with very fine detail. It's a super duper example of a cartouche. And this is how the word breaks down. So what I've done here is to transcribe the signs that make up Tutankhamun's name here using a hieroglyphic font on my computer. And these signs can be transliterated to give them their sound values as follows. So the top group of 3 signs, and I'm sorry if it seems a bit weird that I've written the transliteration on the right here in this odd way. I've tried to do it in such a way that you can see how the Egyptian signs are arranged, how the sounds are arranged. So this reed leaf here is a yod, which has the value sort of an I sound, I. Then this is a gaming board at the top here, like a sort of chessboard or something with little squares that you put the gaming pieces on, and then the gaming pieces are arranged along one side as if on the top of the board. So most of the time when this hieroglyph is written, even if it's inscribed in stone or whatever, you don't see the detail of the squares of the gaming board. You see something much more like this, which would make it a bit harder to identify, but it's clear from this very fine example of the cartouche that that's what this is. It's the gaming board, and that has the phonetic values M and N. It is what we call a biliteral sign. So rather than conveying just one sound, it conveys two. And then this wiggly line, wavy line, represents the ripples or the waves of water, and it has the phonetic value N. In this case, the N is what we call a phonetic complement. We don't need two of these N's, and we've already got one in the men sign, and then we've got an N which just sort of confirms that that is the sound. Then, moving on, these semicircular signs you might remember from the cartouches of Ptolemy and Cleopatra. These have the value T. So we've got two of these T's, between which is a bird. It's a quail chick, which has the phonetic value W. Egyptian, in case it's not already becoming clear, generally doesn't write vowel sounds, or it very often doesn't write vowel sounds. So in order to be able to vocalize the language, where those, by the way, where those vowel sounds are omitted, they must have been there. There must have been a way of vocalizing vowel sounds. We're just ignorant as to what those were. So in the absence of any better information about this, the convention in Egyptology is to arbitrarily insert an unvoiced E, in between. Hence, rather than this M and N being N, we would say men, and rather than this N being N, we would say N. In the case of this group, TWT, we could say Tewet, but actually we tend to go with the idea that while the quail chick, the W, can be a hard W, and such as you get at the beginning of the word Wednesday, or Winchester, or windscreen wiper, etc., etc. It also has the a kind of oo value. So rather than woo, 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 it's a ooh, ooh, as it were. I'm not sure I'm explaining this very well. But so here, rather than this being tewet, this is toot, toot. And the final sign in the sequence is well known beyond Egyptology, even as an ankh sign, a symbol of life. So that altogether is a triliteral sign, if you like, giving us this is a character that comes from Hebrew. We call it an ayin, and it has a kind of vowel value which we would pronounce as a long kind of R. Sure, that's not how the Egyptians pronounced it, but for an English speaker used to English sounds, that is how we pronounce it, R. And then an N, and then one of four different types of H in Egyptian. This is the third H, I think, which we pronounce as in Scottish loch. So altogether. Okay, hope you're still with me. You might already be wondering why you have imen, and in fact we understand from Coptic that this word that looks like we think imen is actually pronounced amun or amun, comes first and is then followed by tut ankh, amun tut ankh. The reason is that Amun is the name of the god Amun, and it therefore comes first because it's the most, in the way it's written, because it's the most important word in the sequence. We call this phenomenon, by which the names of gods are written at the beginning, even if we think that they form the last component of the word, we call this honorific transposition. And by the way, although we don't see it here in this cartouche, it's also sometimes the way that individual signs within a word can be, their place can be switched around in order to make the signs fit the space better. I'm sure you've noticed that, as with the cartouche shaped box here from Tutankhamun's tomb, the signs are all arranged very neatly, so they occupy the space very beautifully, as if a graphic designer has had a go at everything. Sometimes, if the signs were all written out in exactly the right sequence, it would be very difficult to achieve that kind of neatness. So they are occasionally switched around, and we call that graphic transposition. So these are two ways in which hieroglyphs can sometimes trip you up when you're reading them. Now, as the last thing I want us to do, aware as I am that we are slightly overrunning, I hope you'll forgive me, as you usually do, we are going to transliterate and translate. This is a phrase that fills me with terror, because this is what exams in hieroglyphs would ask you to do, and then you'd just be faced with a page of hieroglyphic signs and 3 hours to get through them. So that's what we're going to do, though, with this very short inscription. So as before, first thing I've done is to transcribe the hieroglyphs, at least the part of the cartouche that spells out the name Tutankhamun, using a hieroglyphic font on the computer. And as you'll see here, I've rearranged them so that they all run in a nice horizontal line. Although, as you'll see, I've still arranged them in some cases with one sign above the other, or as with the quail chick, the T's sort of arranged so they fit nicely around the bird. In case it's not already obvious, it probably isn't. Forgive me. Hieroglyphs could be written left to right, running left to right, as here on the box. They could equally be written right to left, in which case they would all be a mirror image. They would be, the orientation of the signs would be flipped. They can run in horizontal rows, or they can run down columns. So this is a very short column, but it's a column nonetheless, with the hieroglyphs in sort of groups, reading left to right, but then also down the lid. You don't need to be able to read hieroglyphs to know which direction the signs are written in, because the rule is that the living things, men, women, gods and goddesses, animals, birds, fish, etc., they always face the beginning of the sentence. So as here, the quail chick is facing left, so that means you start left and you read towards the right. So this is our transcription. The next thing we need to do is what we call transliterate. So convert the signs into their sound values. And we use for this a particular font, because our Latin characters don't allow us to convey all of the individual sound values that the hieroglyphic signs have. So in order to make use of individual characters which convey those specific sounds, we need to borrow a few characters here and there from other scripts. So a mixture of Latin characters and characters borrowed from other scripts gives us a transliteration font. So I have a transliteration font installed on my computer. So you can see the product of that here on the left-hand side. So Amun Tut Ankh is written in transliteration font as here. And you would render Egyptian words in transliteration in a specialist article or a specialist book in a transliteration font. But often in non-specialist literature, so more general books or a newspaper article or something like that, if you were trying to write the sound values of the Egyptian words, you would do so in Latin characters, adding in letters and vowel sounds to allow them to be vocalized as we think they should be vocalized, and then you would put them in italics. So Amun Tut Ankh looks like this in transliteration font, but if I were to write that in a non-specialist book, oops, pardon me, I would be writing Amun Tut Ankh, something like this, maybe with hyphens to connect them together as well. So by the way, this is taken from Alan Gardner's Egyptian Grammar, the transliteration alphabet, if you like. So these are the hieroglyphic signs on the left-hand side here, which we refer to as the alphabetic signs. They are by no means the only hieroglyphic signs, but they are the ones which have one single or phonetic value which equates to one single sound in our alphabet or close to. And as you'll see at the top here, a few of what are the closest Egyptian rights to vowel sounds require us to borrow signs from elsewhere. So the vulture sign here, which we vocalize with a long kind of R, is written in transliteration as an aleph, which comes from the Hebrew and Arabic aleph, and has this kind of, it's the closest we can get to it is a kind of R. And the same approximately is true of this sign, which is written by it's the hieroglyphic sign for an arm, a forearm, written with what looks like a kind of apostrophe, which is the Hebrew ayin, Arabic ayin. And again, we vocalize this more or less in more or less the same way as an R sign. The reed leaf, either one or two, or in later texts, the two reed leaves come to be rendered just as two diagonal signs here. These both have the phonetic value E or a longer E, something like that. And then after that, these are more or less all consonantal sounds. As we've seen, the quail chick W sometimes has the value U, depending on the context. The others are all consonants, and they mostly correspond to characters in our own alphabet. But as you'll see, as I mentioned already, there are 4 different H's. Then there are 2 different hard K sounds, 2 S's and 2 T's and 2 D's. And the sequence of all of these characters is a bit unfamiliar to us as well. So you need to be able to memorize not just the characters and their hieroglyphic equivalents, but then also the sequence as well, if you're going to start looking words up in hieroglyphic dictionaries, which is what we're going to do in just a second. By the way, up until very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, there had been subtle variations in the way that some of the hieroglyphic signs were transliterated, and various different schools of Egyptian language in different countries. So the Germans have a particular way of doing things. The English have a different way of doing things. Just subtle variations in the way that some of these signs are transliterated. And in order to do away with that confusion, at the International Congress of Egyptologists, which took place earlier this month, August this month, in Leiden in the Netherlands, a group of specialist linguists got together to try to come up with a new universal standard for transliteration, which they put to the Congress and which was adopted and has now been published. So this is, although if you get to grips with the literature, you'll find subtle variations in the way things are transliterated here and there, sometimes great variation in the way things are transliterated, but usually only subtle. This from now on should be the transliteration system that we're all using. So we've looked at transcription, we've looked at transliteration. The final stage in the process is to translate, of course. So Tutankhamun is an Egyptian word. It has meaning. It's not a foreign word being written phonetically in Egyptian as Alexander, Ptolemy, Cleopatra were. It has meaning in Egyptian. If we were to translate Amun Tutankh or Tutankhamun literally, those words would mean Amun, the name of the god. Tut means image, and Ankh means life or living and associated concepts. So Amun, image, life. Well, that doesn't mean very much with those words kind of spelled out in that disjointed way. We think that the true meaning of the word is something closer to the living image of Amun. So as in languages like French, for example, the adjective in Egyptian follows the noun. So in the case of this name, Tutankhamun he is the image, and he's the living image. So in English, the adjective living comes before the noun image. In the Egyptian, it follows. So it's image living. And as we've seen, thanks to honorific transposition, the name of the god comes first. But once we've sorted all of that out, an English translation would be the living image of Ammon, something like that. There is a final part of the word of the cartouche, which we haven't dealt with so far, and that's these last three signs here. A crook, this strange standing sign, and then this sedge plant at the end here. So again, same procedure. I've transcribed them as here. So they now appear, rather than in beautifully elaborate and decorated hieroglyphs as in the box lid, they're now in more sort of standardized forms here. These are transliterated Hekar, Uinu, Shemau. A literal translation of these words, it would be ruler, Heliopolis, south, or something like that. But a more meaningful translation of those sounds would be the ruler of southern Heliopolis, or Upper Egyptian Heliopolis. And the Heliopolis of the south was Thebes. So a meaningful translation would be ruler of Thebes. So altogether, the cartouche reads Tutankhamun, the ruler of Thebes. And just to go through how we sort of would look all of this up if we weren't sure what all of these things mean. I was taught 25 years ago at Birmingham University by Anthony Leahy, using Alan Gardner's Egyptian grammar. I suspect that not very many students of the Egyptian language are using this anymore, but the sign list, which Gardner published at the end of his book, in which he takes all of the hieroglyphic signs that occur in the kinds of text that he was using as the basis for his book. He grouped them all together according to what seemed to him to be the main categories. So we can see here section A is man and his occupation. There are 55 of those signs. Woman and her occupations, that's only 7 signs, reflecting just what a patriarchal society Egypt was, perhaps. Anthropomorphic deities, 20. Parts of the human body, 63, and so on and so on. And there are something like 27 categories of these altogether. So you can see that there are hundreds and hundreds of signs involved in these texts, which ideally the student needs to be able to recognize and remember. All of them have some kind of, or most of them have some kind of phonetic value. Others of them are what we would call, or what are most commonly used as, determinative signs, which don't provide a phonetic value but give you an idea of the sense of the word. So in the case of Hekar Uinu Shemau, we would start off by looking at the crook sign, and we would go to Gardner's sign list, where he explains that this is a component part of this word Hekar, as here, and I just realized now that I've got an I in there where I should have an aleph. Apologies for that. And one of the meanings of this, as you can see, it has there is a word Hekar meaning scepter, but it can also mean rule. And if we look in our dictionary of Middle Egyptian, this is a concise dictionary, hand autographed by Raymond O. Faulkner. In using the sequence of transliteration characters to thumb to the right page, we would come to Hekar, where we would see that when the word is spelt out with the crook, but also this dotted K, or now Q sound, and aleph, giving us that R sound at the end, so Hekar, ending with a seated man determinative. This means ruler. Altogether. Similarly, if we look for the Unu sound in the middle, we would see that this is an ideogram in the word for a column, but when combined with the determinative sign for a city and the phonetic complement nu, this little pot here, we get Unu, which means Heliopolis. And Unu in Faulkner, as you can see here, is Heliopolis, but Unu Shemau is Thebes. And if we go back to this final sign, the way I've written it in the hieroglyphic font isn't quite the same here, but it's the same sign essentially. This stands for the word Shemayu, meaning Upper Egypt, and Unu Shemayu is our Thebes. So altogether, that is how we would go about reading this name plus epithet from the box in KV 62, Tutankhamun, ruler of Upper Egyptian Heliopolis, which is Thebes. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for indulging me and letting me go over a little. I hope that last section was helpful, particularly for those of you who are not so familiar with the language. If you are very familiar with the language, I hope it wasn't too boring and also too full of mistakes. I'm a bit annoyed about having got the wrong character in Hekar there, but there we go. Thank you for coming. If you've got any questions, I didn't say this earlier, but I trust probably most of you will know this already. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them. You just need to type them into the Q&A box, which is part of the Zoom apparatus. It appears at the top of my screen. I'm not sure where it will be for you. So I will head there, and once any questions that are in there are dealt with, I'll head back to the chat if anybody would like to continue the conversation there. Arthur says, I assume that native Egyptians did not have an L sound. Was it imported from Greek? Yeah, this is, I don't know what the latest on this is, Arthur, actually. The lion, the recumbent lion, which is the sign that stands for the L in Ptolemy and the L in Cleopatra, earlier on has the phonetic value R. It crops up quite often in Kushite names written in hieroglyphs as well, such as the name we think is probably Kelbarskin, but maybe Karabaskin, the fourth priest of Ammon and mayor of the town, whose tomb's been investigated by Elena Pishikova and co. in the last few years. It seems likely that Egyptian didn't have an L sound, but the lion, for whatever reason, is the closest approximation to that. So that is what was used when writing foreign Kushite and later Ptolemaic names with that sound. I don't know enough about the way the language evolved by that time to know whether, with all of the imported Kushite, Greek, possibly words from other languages as well, with L sounds, whether hieroglyphic, demotic, etc. Characters came to be used elsewhere for that sound. But yeah, I think that basically you're right. I think, yes. Egyptian probably didn't have an L. It's interesting if you look at the way that Egyptian names are written in, for example, Assyrian, Akkadian, such as they are written in the Amarna letters. Or again, Egyptian and Kushite names are written in the Assyrian annals from the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The way that those names are written is quite different from the way we understand them from the Egyptian. So a good example actually is the name, or Tutankhamun's prenomen, his coronation name, which, based on the hieroglyphs and our understanding of the way the hieroglyphs should be read, is Neb-Khepru-Ra or Neb-Khepru-Re. That appears in the Akkadian of the Amarna letters as Nib-Khepruria, which is close enough in the consonants, but in the vowels it's very different. I remember David Roll talking as well about how given our uncertainty about how about vowel sounds in Egyptian words, how the name that we read as Ramesses could just as easily have been Ria Meshesha or something like that. I think, given what we know from Greek and elsewhere, that Ramesses probably isn't so far off, and Ria Meshesha is probably a little bit far away from what it really was. But it still underlines the point that we really don't know how these things were vocalized. Elizabeth says, why do we say Ammon if the reed leaf is pronounced I? Yeah, good question, Elizabeth. So I think we understand that Ammon, or it's probably better Armoon, is written that way in the Coptic. So probably what happened is that over the centuries, the pronunciation changed, so that the sound that was written by the reed leaf, where it might originally have been something closer to an I or E, came to be an R, or the word Ammon was originally closer to Eman or Iman, and over the centuries came to be pronounced differently, but continued to be written in the same way. I'm trying to think of an example of I don't know. Let's say the difference in the Southern English and Northern English pronunciation of A sounds. So I'm going to run a bath. I'm going to mow the grass. Etc. That's a long A sound for a Southerner. For a Northerner, you're going to run a bath and you're going to mow the grass. And so there are those variations in this case in different parts of the country, but those variations occur over time as well. And the problem we have is that we're so ignorant of the way that Egyptian was pronounced at any point that we can't really see those changes very well. But they must have happened, we think. So that something like that probably explains why that word, which from Coptic, and at the time Coptic was in use, at the time Coptic scripts were being written, Coptic texts were being written, that word, the name of that god, is pronounced Amun or Armoon. It might not have been pronounced like that earlier. I hope that makes sense. But we are really, I maybe sound like I'm making excuses, but I think it's probably fair to say that we really are largely ignorant of how so many of these things were ever pronounced, that it's really difficult to know. But good question, thanks. So I'm going to go to the chats because I think that's all the questions. Oh, Arthur says, here there's a comment, like the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, basically Greek with extra symbols. Yeah, yes, for sounds not occurring in Greek, yes. Arthur says, Dasasi did not address the elephant in the tomb. Yes, I see what you mean. Yes, maybe he didn't. Yes and no. Yes, one wonders what Ramesses would have made of his name remaining obscure for as long as it did. Anastasia says, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Thank you for coming. And Kaylee says, rambling thought, I wonder, since the direction of writing could go multiple ways, that there was a general acceptance of scribes who were left-handed, or is there a specific reason why it's done multiple ways? Good question, Kaylee. I suppose it partly depends on context, but hieroglyphic texts are very often paired with images, and if you think about and often texts and images are paired with architecture as well, particularly in the context of you know, temples, tombs, or an inscription on the wall of any building, usually temples or tombs, or indeed this would apply to statuary as well. The texts ideally are read in the same direction as you would sort of look at the wall, or you would walk through the temple or walk through the tomb. So if you're walking through a temple, and you look up to your left as you're walking along, it makes sense for the inscription to read from left to right. So as you're looking up to your left, you're reading it as you go along, and heading in the right direction. Equally, if you were to look up to the right as you walked along instead of to the left, you might possibly see a very similar inscription that would also need to read in the same direction, so the direction you're moving. But that means that the signs and everything have to be completely reversed. They have to be a mirror image. So I suspect that symmetry is partly to do with it, or just kind of graphic or spatial kind of considerations. But other than that, I don't know how we could really know. And I don't know enough to be honest, about the development of other languages. And you know, there's now a convention for us that everything goes in English goes left to right. Arabic goes right to left. How that comes to be decided, I'm not sure. Stevie says, Kay says that makes sense. That's good. Stevie says, thanks, Chris. Great explanation of things that are not often talked about in relation to doing hieroglyphs, but what about the other elephant in the cupboard? Grammar. Certainly my elephant. Yeah. Yes. Stevie, so you obviously know that when you study the language, any of you who have studied the language, I'm sure will know this, it isn't too long before you have to confront the fact that all but the very shortest inscriptions involve grammar and syntax. So sentences are constructed in particular ways. We just hinted at one element of Egyptian syntax here, which is that adjectives follow nouns rather than, as they do in English, preceding nouns. Yes, and you're hit with that very early on, aren't you? And for those of us who were never even taught to understand our own language in terms of grammar, that can be quite a shock. I remember hearing from colleagues that at one university in the UK, they started off with something like 60 students from the archaeology or ancient history department. They started off with 60 students doing introduction to Middle Egyptian, I think it would have been, knowing very well that that was going to reduce, you know, down to 15 or 20 within a few classes, because so many people, and I'm sure I was the same, your expectation is that it's going to be this kind of cool thing to do, to make some sense of you know, man, bird, man in inscriptions, only to find that actually what you're doing is, yes, you are recognizing the forms of the signs and learning to draw them, but then there's an awful lot of suffix pronouns and participles and relative forms and all of that sort of stuff, and it's pretty hardcore. And something I didn't say actually when we did our little exercise in transcription, transliteration and translation, we were looking at, of course, just a single name with an epithet without paying any attention to the grammar. But when you're assessed, or at least this is how it was when I was doing it, when you're assessed, you also need, there's another line, you need to give a grammatical commentary. So you need to be able to know when you're translating a longer text that, well, this is a Sejm F present tense. This is a Sejm NF past tense. This is a Sejmu F relative form. This is a, you know, whatever. it's all pretty hardcore. And I'm very glad to tell you that beyond the point at which I was doing exams in the Egyptian language, I have not really ever myself had to get involved in any of that ever again. Thank goodness. Anastasia says, if we take into consideration the fact that even nowadays the names of different countries are pronounced with a vast variation in foreign languages, yeah, it's easy to think that the same happened in ancient times. For example, between the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Hittites, they pronounce names differently. Yeah. The same happened with Herodotus when he writes about Egypt. So we cannot draw conclusions that way, I think. I'm not sure about your final point there, Anastasia, but that's more or less exactly what I was trying to say, is that yes, that exactly as today, words are rendered subtly differently in different languages. And you're right, no doubt, exactly as today, even when it's exactly the same words etymologically that are concerned, they end up getting written differently in different languages. No doubt, because people hear and are able to say things differently. Yeah, so I agree with you entirely. Arthur says Latin was quite a shock as speakers of non-inflected language, third person plural, present indicative. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, like I say, it was quite a shock. By the time I started studying Egyptian, I was really determined to do it. And in fact, I'd been given special permission. My particular degree program at Birmingham University didn't require me to do a language, but I put it to them that they should let me do it, and they did. So I kind of sat in on introductory year in my final year as an undergraduate, and then carried on as a postgraduate. So that was a bit unusual, but in fact, two of my colleagues did the same as well. And I'm really glad I did. Except that if I'd wanted better grades, it probably would have been better to duck hieroglyphs, because it's just really hard. And I did better in essay-based non-language things. But still, I'm really glad to have done it, because it does give you a better understanding, I think, or an enhanced understanding of ancient Egypt, to be able to work with the language. It's not the only way to study ancient Egypt, and of course there are specialists who make entire excellent research careers without ever knowing the language. But yeah, I'm glad to have done it myself, difficult as it was. Okay, folks. I think we got to the end of the questions, and we got to the end of the chat. I can see a few of you are still here. So thank you very much for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed it today. As usual, I will post my slides to my website, and a little guide to further reading as well. There are a few things that it occurred to me might be useful kind of supplements to this talk. So yeah, I'll do that. I'll try and get that up in the next day or so before I move on to something else. I'm not absolutely certain when my next online talk is going to be. I've got a few talks coming up in person, and those are on my website. I've been invited to do a talk in Dublin a week on Saturday. That's Saturday the 9th of September. Who knows, I might even see one or two of you there. But actually, I just heard yesterday that talk is going to be online as well as in person. I'm not sure if that means it's going to be completely free and publicly available, or how that will work. But yeah, that's what we're doing, and there will be more online talks coming. As I mentioned at the start, for those of you who are here, I'm thinking about continuing the experiment with YouTube, and I hope that will work well enough for you. So yeah, great. Thanks very much again, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it. Very good to see you all. Very good to be back. I will see you again soon. Thanks for all your thanks and kind comments. Oh, Arthur says, have you a link to find out about the Dublin talk? Yeah, I have it's on my website. Hang on. If you go here, there are details, Arthur, and what I don't have yet is the details of the online part of that. But if and when I get them, I'll add them to my website and to social media. So hopefully you'll be able to catch up if that works for you. Okay, great. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care, and see you at the next one. Bye for now.